What's up, guys? Today I wanted to share 7 reasons why I hate tight range liquidity pools. I personally think it's more trouble than it's worth, but a lot of times there are some situations where tighter range liquidity could be a better choice for you. Just a quick disclaimer, this is not financial advice. My strategy and market outlook would be different from yours. Please do your own research before you make any investments. And before we dive in here, you can see my portfolio is up pretty nicely right now, roughly 10.19 ETH on open positions. Closed positions, roughly 7.7 ETH of profit. And I don't track US dollar value as much because I'm trying to have a crypto profit, more specifically Ethereum. But you can see recently it's flipped positive as well. And if you want to compare the benchmark against holding, you can see I'm up pretty nicely against holding, earning roughly 50% APR on my current capital. So my strategies have been working pretty well for me. And in this video, I'll break down the pros and cons of tight range liquidity pools. If we expand any of these positions here, you can see I'm running a pretty wide range strategy. For example, on this ETH and SOL, my ranges are set at all the way 0.025 to 0.099 compared to a lot of these tighter range liquidity providers. So knowing the risk and the reward behind tight range liquidity pools will make you a better yield farmer. So let's take this example. Let's say I am providing liquidity for Ethereum and USDC. I'm using this pair just so it's easier to think through. Let's say I set my bottom range to be roughly $1,800 and my top range to be $2,200. And actually, this is what some people also did when Ethereum and USDC was moving sideways for a little bit here before it dumped further. Now it's popping back into range and maybe it's going to exit the top side in a few days here. But the first idea I want to talk about is the impermanent loss. Let's say I deposit $10,000 worth of Ethereum and USDC into this pool. Let's use price now as $2,000 just to keep it simple. Price deposit $2,000, price upper $2,200, and then price lower is $1,800 like we talked about. So at the price now, you can see there's zero impermanent loss because impermanent loss happens when the price diverges from your entry. So if we move to, let's say, $3,000, you can see I would suffer a 17% impermanent loss. And then if I move to 4,000, I would suffer an almost 30% worth of impermanent loss. And it works both ways, right? Going upwards or going downwards. Let's say ETH trades at $1,000, then my impermanent loss would be 32.6%. And that's not the total loss, right? Impermanent loss is comparing like the amount you would have holding the tokens you deposited. For example, if you held like the ETH and USDC you deposited, you would have had $7,500 something versus if it's in the liquidity pool and it dumps out of range, you're fully into Ethereum. So then your LP would be worth roughly $5,000 something. So the first con is you're going to suffer a lot of impermanent loss with tight ranges. If we expand the range to, let's say, 1,000 to 5,000, for example, you can see my impermanent loss on the $1,000 downside drops all the way down to 18%. The lower the impermanent loss, the lower the total loss is as well, right? Because it's much closer to the holding number. And when it pumps to the upside, let's say at $4,000, I'm suffering only a 16.7% impermanent loss. So on the upside, I would also gain more as well compared to tighter ranges. And if your goal is to beat holding in the market, then you're trying to beat impermanent loss basically. And the way you beat impermanent loss is you want to make sure that the APR and the fees you get is greater than the impermanent loss over the span of at least 1 year. So theoretically, if I'm gaining like 20% APR on this pool with these wide ranges, then I would be impermanent loss if Ethereum is trading at $4,000 1 year from now. But if it teleports to like $4,000 the next day, then I wouldn't be impermanent loss, right? I would still be at a nice US dollar profit, but I wouldn't be beating just holding in the market. But if we go back to the 1,800 to 2,200, Example here, a 30% impermanent loss is quite high, especially if you're setting these tight ranges. You're not going to stay in range for a very long time, right? So assuming you get like 100% APR on this range, for example, then you need to be in range at least like 30.7% of the time, assuming there's no rebalances at all, right? To be able to beat holding in the market. But you can see if I back test like the range here, it's not very likely that I'm going to stay in range 30% of the time without any rebalancing, right? And this is the main reason why tight range liquidity providers don't actually beat impermanent loss, is because the ranges are too tight. They're not able to capture enough fees to offset the impermanent loss. And the second drawback is that you're missing out on a lot of the pump. So let's use Metrics Finance Pro for this example here because it's easier to visualize. Ethereum is trading at roughly $2,200 right now. Let's say I squeeze the range to have roughly like 50% ETH and USDC at the minimum price of 2,000 and max price of 2,450. Then let's say Ethereum moves to like $3,000 or $4,000 in the next few months. With a $10,000 deposit value, you could see my LP would only appreciate by $200 something, right? So if Ethereum has a big move up to $3,000 to $4,000, doesn't matter when it happens, like in the next few days or in the next few weeks or the next few months, I would be missing out on a lot of the upside compared to if I have a bullish range of, let's say, the minimum price, you could keep the same. And let's exaggerate this to like $10,000. So the APR at this current liquidity distribution is still pretty decent at 23%. But if we pump to $4,000, you could see my LP value would be at $15,397. So more than $5,000 extra than what I would have with that very tight range. And during this whole time, I'm earning at least roughly 15 to 20% APR, right? To me, that's not a bad deal at all. And it's simply going to outperform these tight range liquidity providers. So that's the second drawback with the tight range liquidity pool. And if we switch back here to 2450, the third drawback is that you're actually exposed to like the same amount of downside or more downside depending on what you set the bottom range at. Let's say Ethereum drops to all the way to $1,000, then my LP value would be worth like $4,700 something, right? Pretty much a 50% drop from $10,000 to $4,000 something. That's because when it exits the bottom range at this $2,000 mark, my LP is fully converted to Ethereum at that point. But if I'm running a wider range strategy, and let's say it's 1,000 to 5,000, keep the ratio roughly at 50 to 50 to make it fair. Basically at $1,000, I would still be in range and my LP value would be $5,860. Of course, still a pretty sharp drop because Ethereum's price would drop pretty sharply, right? But I'm up like roughly $1,000 more than what I had with the tighter range liquidity. And that's a roughly 20% difference, which is pretty significant. And this is especially true for like lower cap pairs. When you're providing liquidity for, let's say you were squeezing the range all the way up here back in December and January, and the price dropped pretty sharply, right? That's what a lot of people did. And they basically got wrecked in their liquidity pools and suffered like a huge drawdown. So there's a lot more downside to the dumps, and the market is very hard to predict, right? If a big dump occurs, you're knocked out of range, you're not earning any fees, and you're basically forced to rebalance if you want to earn fees. Which leads to my fourth point. The downside is that you're going to have to manage your liquidity pools more often. Personally, I don't rebalance my pools very often at all. If you can see some of my pools here, for example, this Pixel and ETH here, it's been in range for like the last 163 days, basically printing like an 81% APR. Or this ETH and Arrow pool here that I've been in range for a while, roughly like 94 days, slightly below my entry, but you could see my fees more than make up for it. And I get a much better ROI on my time because when you're running tight range liquidity pools, a lot of times you're chasing like ranges. You were providing liquidity here, and then when the price goes up, you're chasing the range here. You gotta calculate like how much you want to rebalance, if it's worth it, right? You gotta make a lot of important decisions. And sometimes it doesn't even work out in your favor, right? Because the price again dumps, you locked in a lot of apparent loss, and then you're at a huge loss when this happens, right? This is exactly what some people do. They were providing liquidity here, and then they're chasing the range upwards. When the price dumps, they're chasing downwards, downwards, downwards. They rebalance again, again, and again. And then when the price recovers, they miss out on a lot of the upside. So you might start with like $10,000 here, earn some fees, maybe work up to like $13,000. And then up here, you have $13,000, earn some fees. Maybe you're at like $14,000. And then a huge dump occurs. You have less than maybe like $7,000, right? You decide to rebalance and rebalance. When it rockets back up, you might have gained some asset appreciation and fees. Maybe you worked yourself up to like $9,000, but then it's still less than what you started out with at like $10,000, right? And I see this all the time during my time of yield farming. I've stocked a lot of portfolios, and they chase the ranges and end up with less capital than what they started out with, which is my fifth point. The fees you earn could be basically outweighed by apparent loss, and you could still underperform wider ranges, especially during the long run. It doesn't matter if I'm earning like 100% APR during the year, but then I suffer roughly 80% loss from locking in apparent losses. My APR would still average out to be only 20%. Versus if I'm entering pools at a good price, I average, let's say 20-30% APR. I have very minimal apparent loss. Or if I gain like a positive apparent loss, or my capital appreciates. And that's exactly my strategy here. Instead of running tight ranges, trying to predict where the market is going to move sideways. And for me, it's much easier to stay profitable in the long run. And the sixth drawback is that when there's a big move in the market, like what we saw a few weeks back, there's often a lot of fees and volume that comes with it. So let's say I have this wide range liquidity pool set up, right? I could change this liquidity concentration to basically calculate my APR. And let's say Ethereum pumps to like 2,600. You can see my APR jumped from like 20 something percent to 75%. And this is what exactly happens to me all the time in these concentrated liquidity pools. There's a big move in the market. I gain like pretty high APR for a few days before the liquidity adjusts, or even a few weeks, and it could move back and forth, right? It could go back down to like the high liquidity concentration, or it could, move all the way down to where the liquidity concentration is very, very low. I could be earning hundreds of dollars during the day, while these tight range liquidity basically suffers like a lot, while not benefiting from that volatility in the market. It could go to the downside or the upside, right? If the custom price goes to like 3,000, you could see my APR would be pretty elevated here. And I'll show you guys like an actual example of this. For example, Sol to ETH during April 20th, there's a pretty big price movement, and you can see $160 worth of fees, where on average I'm earning less than like $10 to $30 per day, right? And that's where a lot of those APR comes from. It's from these like high volume and high price movement days. You can see roughly like $15 to $20 a day. And then there are big price movement days where I earn like 70, 170, almost $200 worth of fees on my capital, which is why I'm able to average such a high APR on my capital. So moves in the market like that basically push like these tight range liquidity pools out of range. And if you're a tight range liquidity provider, basically you earn no fees when those big moves happen. And the seventh drawback that I see with tight range liquidity pool is that there's simply more stress to manage it. Because let's say you were providing liquidity here, and then Ethereum pumps upwards against USD, then you're forced to basically make another decision whether or not to rebalance. How are you going to rebalance, right? Are you going to do like a snuggle rebalance where you expand the range? But then again, if you are going to expand the range, why not start with a wider range to begin with. And you gotta calculate a lot of those like impermanent loss. How much are you locking in terms of impermanent loss? Is it gonna be worth it if I lock in that impermanent loss? And you can never tell where the market is going to move, right? For example, if you rebalance down here and then you were expecting Ethereum to move sideways below $2,000 for a while, then you were wrong. Or let's say like you rebalance up here and then Ethereum draws back down, then you might be wrong again, right? So these tight range liquidity pools, a lot of times they're trying to like time the market and trying to get in range where the market is going to move sideways. But if you've been in crypto for a while, you would know that there's often like a period of time where crypto moves sideways and then suddenly it moves upward or moves downward. So it's a lot more stress to manage, especially if you're running like 5 to 10 positions. It could easily become like a full-time job. So those are the cons. And let's now talk about the pros. The first advantage of tight range liquidity is that you could be gaining a higher APR, assuming you could stay in range. So for crypto to stable pairs, it's pretty hard to stay in range in a tight range liquidity pool because it's very volatile, right? Because USD is stable while you're pairing a volatile asset. But let's say you have a pretty reasonably tight range here during the bear market, you could see that you're probably outperforming wide range liquidity pools in terms of fees during this whole period of roughly 500 something days. So if you could stay in range for a long time during that time, you might be outperforming pools that are basically this wide, for example, but then you're forced to rebalance again or use your capital elsewhere if it moves out of your position. So higher fees if you can manage to stay in range, and it might make more sense for like a crypto to crypto pair, for example, Sol to Bitcoin. If you were to set the ranges here, you could see if you stayed in range here, you would have outperformed wide range liquidity providers. But again, once it dumps out of range, then you're going to suffer more losses than people with a wide range. And the second benefit is that it could make sense in a more leveraged setup. For example, I'm lending Ethereum on lending platforms like Aave, and then I'm borrowing USDC to yield farm with. I might set a tighter range, for example, here to here. And then it's okay if it exits the top range because I still have the Ethereum that I lent, the upside exposure. I'm not missing out on a lot of the upside doing that. And I can simply just withdraw my USDC from the pool that got pumped out of range to pay back my loans. So it could definitely make sense in a leverage setup. But if you're not running a leverage setup or if you're a beginner, then tight range liquidity pools often would give you more trouble than the benefit. And the third benefit that we kind of touched on already is that it could work great in a crab market or where there's like less volatility. Like for example, during the Sol and Bitcoin pair in 2024, and it works really well on highly correlated pairs. But again, you never know when the correlation is going to break, for example, back here in February, or if it's going to like get back into the original range you have. So one strategy that worked well for me in the past for tight range liquidity pool is I'm running a nested setup. So this typically works well for pairs that you believe there's a lot of upside, especially on lower cap tokens. So in my example, I was running this setup with Pixel and ETH. Pixel is a very small cap gaming token that I'm bullish on. But the idea of this setup is basically you have two liquidity pools, one liquidity pool that is wider on this orange lines here, and then one liquidity pool that is tighter on these blue lines. And what I would do is basically this pool would earn more fees. So I'm going to compound my fees into this tighter range pool when it's earning a lot of fees, as well as compound it to this wider range pool because I don't want to miss out on the upside. So this allows you to earn high fees on these tight pools. And when it exits the upside, it's okay. You just take profits on those pools. And then now you're left with this wider range liquidity pool. And the reason why it works well is because we never know if like the pool is going to stay in range for a long time or not. And if it does, then this tighter pool would outperform this wider pool. But if it moves out of range pretty quickly here, then the wider pool would make a lot of gains. So the way I split it is basically I put roughly like 20 to 30% of my allocation to that specific pair into this tight range, and then I stick the rest into this wide range. And if I'm earning, let's say like 200, 300% APR on this tight range, that allocation could be basically start from like an 80-20 and it creeps up to like 30-70, 40-60. And at any time I could just withdraw it and then set it wide as well. And that's exactly what I did. I expect a bigger price movement upwards from this pair in the next couple of months. So I basically exited this tight range liquidity and put whatever I have in the HODL bag or like into this wider range liquidity pool. And I'm currently still running this setup, but with much wider ranges because I want to capture the upside. For example, this min and max price here, you could see the max price is roughly like a 20x from the current price. So that's the tighter range liquidity pool I'm talking about, even though it's pretty wide because I've already set up a even wider range where it's like a basically 40x from the current price. So you could see in an event where like the catalyst drops and there's like a parabolic move upward, then I could expect to make a lot of fees during that time. So that's the nested strategy. And I hope that makes sense for you guys and there's some value that you guys got out of it. Again, I personally prefer wider range strategies, and it's not like I'm earning very little APR, right? I'm averaging roughly 50% APR right now. It could drop to 30 or it could pump all the way to 75, 100%. If we see more volume here. For me, it makes much more sense and it's much safer and much easier to manage. If you guys want to learn more about yield farming, there's a lot of videos on my channel talking about yield farming, more specifically concentrated liquidity pools. That's where I make most of my gains and have been basically able to replace my income with liquidity pools. If you guys like this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Hit that bell icon if you want to be notified when I drop a new video. Thank you guys once again for watching. I'll catch you guys next time.